What do you think is the biggest climate threat?
I think actually conspiracy theories.
So what gives you the hope for finding a solution to our climate problems?
The fact that if we don't act, there won't be a world to live in.
Why don't you think people act?
I think people want to act, but I think that either they don't know what to do or they kind of discount the problem. So they use various defense mechanisms to not actually think of how huge this problem is for us.
And tell us, what is your unsustainable guilty pleasure?
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. Amazon purchases. Terrible. I feel so guilty.
Here is a podcast, a product of Rethinking Climate. Rethinking Climate is a nonprofit communication project that tries to open conversations about complex and overlooked climate issues to make them more personal and accessible. We investigate how the climate crisis is spoken about. So today we are pleased to welcome Carolina Trella. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
So she got her BA in marketing with a minor in philosophy. She's interested in the psychology behind compulsive consumption. Because of this, she moved to London and she earned her Master of Science with distinction in consumer psychology in a joint program between London Metropolitan University and UCL. She worked several years in the marketing field, and now she is starting a Ph.D. in social psychology at the University of Kent, investigating the psycho-sociological barriers to collective action against climate change. So that's very interesting. Carolina, what you're doing. Can you tell us a little more about it?
Yeah, sure. So what I tried to find out in my research is to understand better what are the reasons why people. We know that there is an issue of climate change. We know that some of us know that it's a fact, right? Because otherwise there are people who believe in conspiracy theories. But for those of us who know it's a fact, we try to act on it. We try to mitigate the problem. So we recycle and we try to be as sustainable as possible. But it's not only it's not enough, but we constantly feel a huge anxiety and we feel guilty for this issue that is never going to be solved. And so I got really interested in, for my personal reasons, because I started feeling guilty and I had anxiety about it. And I remember, so this was, I think it was during there were fires everywhere and every newspaper headline was saying how we're all going to die soon. And so I started thinking about this and also looking at how people have reacted to COVID. So COVID is a very salient problem. So everyone knows what COVID is, what's going on. We feel constantly scared to get COVID or that one of our loved ones gets COVID, and we actually act on it. So we put masks on, right? We socially distance. And I was just trying to understand why is it that for COVID we have huge collective action to mitigate that problem, and instead with climate change that is huge and it's as important as COVID, maybe even more, then why aren't people actually moving that way, right? What most of the research is looking at is actually not at the individual, but how politically this might be addressed. Because the fundamental issue with climate change is that every nation, a country would maybe stop the economy and and the capitalism that requires CO2 emissions and so on to maybe stop climate change. But if Italy does it and the UK doesn't, then Italy will still get the issue of climate change. They will, we will still have an issue without having the economic gain. So that's kind of the problem. It's a we're all in this together kind of thing, and no one wants to start to actually do anything about it. And so, that's really interesting to me to see how this is a collective issue. Yeah, it's how it's spoken about. It seems like it's an individual problem. So if you read newspaper headlines or articles, it's always about how you, the individual, you're not doing enough but you as an individual cannot solve the problem. So why is it asked this way?
Do you think that what the newspaper are trying to do is trying to push individuals collectively? So that sort of sense that if I convince you, then I convince your neighbor, then I convince your family and loved ones, then we could all do everything.
I think that what the newspapers are doing is to actually try to create even more emotional guilt for these issues. And I really think that they think that that's the best way to act, not only to report what's happening, but also as a sort of manipulation of emotions to actually make people, mitigate climate change. But I think, and we know actually, there's tons of research on this, that the human brain kind of completely goes blank when it's overwhelmed by emotion, and they stop doing what they're actually even doing. So, for example, we have with climate change, a lot of people, when you ask them, what do you think about climate change? What are you worried about it? A lot of people will tell you, sure, I'm worried, but it's the next generation's problem, or it's not going to happen for another 50 years. So why should I do anything about it? Right. And it's because and this is my personal idea, that you are constantly overwhelmed by guilt feelings and anxiety. And there's even, there's actually a paper that just came out on climate anxiety as a pathology. So something that psychiatrists will actually be able to diagnose. So it's become a huge issue, and people are just constantly overwhelmed by these emotions, and that just makes the brain freeze and not able to act on it.
Do you think that if we spoke more realistically or improve the way we talk about the problem, it might help people handle the solution better?
I think it's a delicate balance to understand how to communicate the problem efficiently so that it becomes salient in people's minds, and so that people can actually think about the issue. And I think it's quite difficult to understand the balance between saliency and overwhelming the individual. And I think that's definitely possible. And I don't know how, but I do think that there's a solution for this. And I do think that the media needs to be much more careful on how it talks about these issues, because then, it's the typical conversations that you maybe have with friends or with family members, where you read a newspaper and then you talk about it at a dinner table, for example, right? And if it's framed in such a way that it's all about how you need to feel guilty, then that's the conversation you're going to have, right? And so just a shift in focus might be the trick. I mean, I'm kind of optimistic on this possibly, but I really do think so. And also, we're seeing that people's major issue with climate change is not so much the debate of whether it exists or not, which is something that we thought some time ago, but it's more about a solution aversion. So our issue apparently with it is that we don't agree with the solution that the government poses to actually mitigate it. And so that's our issue. So we're seeing, for example, we know that conservatives and Republicans in all of the world are less likely to endorse green policies. But is it because they don't care about climate change, or is it maybe because the same parties that endorse these policies are also pro-choice, for example? And so there's a discrepancy in values that might be the actual issue.
That says a lot, because there's so many opinions about things that match and mix between each other. What about the conversations with polluting companies? Research shows that if you do move to green energy, for instance, it might be more expensive now, but on a long term, you're actually saving money. And it is a new field of interest that can bring more funds, more profit. How do you think the conversation there is going? Why wouldn't CEOs feel guilty or anxious?
Well, I think we have created a social system and an economic system to sustain it that is not really, that not only it's not helping climate change, it's causing it, right? But we don't, the majority of the population doesn't really understand how consumerism works and what the value of money actually is. So we don't think, for example, that if I have $1, it means that someone else cannot have that $1. We do not think of it that way. And this is also because, for example, we have, we're living in a moment in time where there is such an abstraction of money, for example, with credit cards, right? With cash, we know what we're spending all the time. But with credit cards, we don't think about money anymore. And so it becomes this abstract idea, and we don't really see that what money is something that if I have it, you don't. So it's social. It's fundamentally social. And it is the reason why there need to be, to sustain capitalism, there need to be industries that pollute so much. But it's the social system in itself that is not really helpful. For example, I was actually watching one of those Facebook videos the other day on this completely sustainable supermarket, and it's all food from the garden, and there's no plastic, and everything is reusable, and it's fantastic. But it's not something that we see in every corner in every city. And instead, if you go to the supermarket, if you shop at the more convenient place for you, then there is a ton of waste. But at the same time, you cannot be an individual in this society, living in this society, and not produce waste. There are very few cases, very few people that can actually manage this, because it's such a sacrifice socially. And so I think there's a huge conflict in that.
Because I've actually wondered about this a couple of days ago, and because you see it on Instagram, on social media in general, all the time, products that will help you save waste, or not produce it, but options about, I don't know, even personal hygiene. There's so many now eco-friendly options you could use in the kitchen or in the house, in everyday life, more or less. And I was thinking, what if we actually brought those options to the supermarket, or as you were saying, a more place where I feel safer, or it feels more known to me. Mm. But at the same time, as exactly you were saying, your unsustainable guilty pleasure is online buying, and you're not alone in this. We're all guilty of it, majority of us. And why is it so hard then, in your opinion, for somebody to pick buying online something that could be eco-friendly and maybe cheaper as well, rather than having to find it at the supermarket, because otherwise they wouldn't pick buying that product?
I think there's a lot of confusion on what is actually killing the planet. And we know, for example, that traveling a lot isn't good for the planet. But how many people actually know how much your car actually emits? I think it's more about that, so that everything is an issue for the climate. But we don't know, as a population, we don't know what we need to sacrifice to actually make a difference. And so I think it's more about that. Also, about the eco-friendly products, I really don't agree with that. I really don't agree with eco-friendly products. And the reason for this is that I think it's fantastic that we're trying to find a way to find a compromise between capitalism and these issues that it has created, but it's still the same system. It's still the same idea, right? The real problem isn't in creating products that are full of plastic. The problem is that we constantly need to produce them, and we need to buy more and more and more. And so if we continue to create eco-friendly products, then the same mentality of consumers will stay, of this compulsive consumption, right? Where you still need to buy and accumulate capital. Which is the whole point of the system, right?
Yeah, okay.
So it's not really helping in that respect, I think.
I really like what you're saying, because it has always been a little bit of wonder of mine. Like, we still keep producing all of these products, but we're producing something anyways. So it's very refreshing what you're saying. So I'm very glad you did. It makes me wonder a little bit about we can say in a positive way, not to make any polemic about it, but then the parents who've lived in generations where that was okay, or at least in our generation, our parents lived in a growth generation, because in Italy, our parents, the age they grew up in upcoming economy, and then when we were born, more or less, that was when the downfall happened. Do you think that instead of teaching only science of climate change within schools, we should teach a little bit about when you buy, what happens?
You just listened to the first half of the episode. Stay tuned for part 2. In the meanwhile, don't forget to follow us on social media, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and thank you for listening. This was Clear in the Air, a product by Rethinking Climate.